Hello there and welcome from Painesville, Ohio. My name is Mark Matsky and today it's my pleasure to read for you Chapter 11 from Magic for Marigold, A Counsel of Perfection. There was really only one creature in the world whom Marigold hated, apart from Clementine, who couldn't be said to be in the world. And that creature was Gwendolyn Vincent Leslie, in the family Bible and on the lips of Aunt Josephine. Everywhere else she was Gwenny, the daughter of Uncle Luther Leslie, who lived away down east at Rush Hill. She was a second cousin of Marigold's, and Marigold had never seen her. Nevertheless, she hated her. In her uprising and her down-sitting, by night and by day, Sundays as well as weekdays, and the cause of this hatred was Aunt Josephine. Aunt Josephine, who was really a second cousin, was a tall, severe lady with a pronounced chin and stabbing black eyes, which Marigold always felt must see to her very bones. X-ray eyes, Uncle Clon called them. She lived in Charlottetown when she was home, which wasn't often. Aunt Josephine was an old maid, not a bachelor girl or a single woman, but a genuine, dyed-in-the-wool old maid. Lazar added that she lived on her relations, by which cannibalish statement he meant that Aunt Josephine was fonder of visiting round than of staying home. She was especially fond of Cloud of Spruce, and came as often as she decently could, and every time she came she praised Gwendolyn Vincent Leslie to the skies. But she never praised Marigold. The very first time she had ever seen Marigold, she had said, looking at her scrutinizing, "Well, you have your father's nose beyond any doubt." Marigold had never known that her father's nose had been his worst point, but she knew Aunt Josephine was not being complimentary. "Gwendolyn Leslie has such a beautiful little nose," continued Aunt Josephine, who had just come from a visit to Luther's. "Purely Grecian. But then, everything about her is beautiful. I have never in all my life seen such a lovely child, and her disposition is as charming as her face. She's very clever, too, and led her class of 20 in school last term. She showed me the picture of an angel in her favorite book of Bible stories and said, 'That is my model, Auntie.'" Who wouldn't hate Gwendolyn after that? And that was only the beginning. All through that visit and every succeeding visit, Aunt Josephine prated about the inexhaustible perfections of Gwendolyn Vincent in season and out of season. Gwendolyn, it appeared, was so conscientious that she wrote down every day all the time she had spent in idleness and prayed over it. She had never, it seemed, given anyone a moment's worry since she was born. She had taken the honor diploma for Sabbath school attendance, Aunt Josephine never said Sunday, every year since she had been going. "She is such a spiritual child," said Aunt Josephine. "Would she jump if you stuck a pin in her?" asked Marigold. Grandmother frowned, and Mother looked shocked, with a glint of unlawful, un-Leslian amusement behind the shock. And Aunt Josephine looked coldly at her. "Gwendolyn is never pert," she rebuked. It also transpired that Gwendolyn always repeated hymns to herself before going to sleep. Marigold, who spent her pre-sleep hours in an orgy of wonderful imagery adventures, felt miserably how far short she fell of Gwendolyn Vincent. And Gwendolyn always ate just what was put before her and never ate too much. "I never saw a child so free from greediness," said Aunt Josephine. Marigold wondered uneasily if Aunt Josephine had noticed her taking that third tart. And with all this, Gwendolen appeared was sensible. Sensible! Marigold knew what that meant. Somebody who would use roses to make soup of if she could. Gwendolen had never had her hair bobbed. And she has such wonderful, luxuriant, thick, long, shining, glossy curls, said Aunt Josephine, who would have added some more adjectives to the curls if she could have thought of them. Grandmother, who did not approve of bobbed hair, looked scornfully at Marigold's sleek, cropped head. Marigold, who had never before known a pang of jealousy in regard to a living creature, was rent with its anguish now. Oh, how she hated this paragon of a Gwendolen Vincent Leslie, this angelic and spiritual being who took honor diplomas and led her class, but who yet, Marigold clutched avidly at the recollection of the note Gwenny had written her at Christmas, didn't appear to know that sapphire shouldn't be spelled Saffire. Gwendolen Vincent was tidy. She was brave, not afraid of thunderstorms, said Aunt Josephine when Marigold cowered in Mother's lap during a terrible one. She always did exactly what she was told. See that, Marigold? Said Grandmother. She never slammed doors. Marigold had just slammed one. She was a wonderful cook for her age. She was never late for meals. See that, Marigold? Said Mother. She never mislaid anything. She always cleaned her teeth after every meal. She never used slang. She never interrupted. She never made grammatical errors. She had perfect teeth. Marigold's eye teeth were just a wee bit too prominent. She was never tomboyish. Marigold had been swinging on a gate. She never was too curious about anything. Marigold had been asking questions. She always was early to bed and early to rise because she knew it was the way and the only way to be healthy and wealthy and wise. I don't believe that, said Marigold rudely. Fidime gets up at 5 o'clock every morning of his life and he's the poorest man in Harmony. And then it appeared that Gwendolen never answered back. Once, and once only, did Marigold for a fleeting moment think she might like Gwendolen in spite of her goodness. It was when Aunt Josephine told how Gwendolen had once got up in the middle of the night and gone downstairs in the dark to let in a poor, cold, miserable pussycat crying on the doorstep. But the next minute Aunt Josephine was describing how careful Gwendolen was to keep her nails clean, looking at Marigold's as she talked. Gwendolen has such lovely white half-moons at the base of her nails. Now, Marigold had no half-moons. In short, though it was never really in short with Aunt Josephine, Gwendolen is a perfect little lady. Somehow that phrase got under Marigold's skin as nothing else had done. I'm fed up with this, she reflected furiously. It was the first time she had ever dared to use this new expression, even in thought. Grandmother and Mother merely got rather tired of things, but rather tired was too mild to express her feelings toward the perfect little lady. And under it all, that persistent stabbing ache of jealousy. Marigold would have liked as well as anyone else to have a clan reputation of being a perfect lady. And now Gwendolen was coming to Cloud of Spruce for a visit. Luther had written Grandmother that he wanted his little girl to visit Harmony and get acquainted with all her relatives. Especially did he want her to know Cloud of Spruce, where he had had such jolly times when a boy. Grandmother screwed up her lips a bit over the reference to jolly times. She remembered some of them. But she wrote back a very cordial invitation. Aunt Josephine, who was just completing a visit, said She hoped if Gwendolen came up for the mooted visit, Marigold would learn from her how a really nice little girl should behave. If Marigold had not been there, Grandmother would have bristled up and said that Marigold was a pretty well-behaved child on the whole, and her friends reasonably satisfied with her. She would probably have added that Luther Leslie had been a devil of a fellow when he was young, and Annie Vincent was the biggest tomboy on the island before she was married, and that it was curious, to say the least of it, that the pair of them should have produced so saintly an offspring. But Marigold was there, so Grandmother had to look at her sternly and say, "I hope so too." Marigold did not know that when she had betaken her wounded spirit to the gay ranks of rosy hollyhocks beside the gray-green apple barn for solace. Grandmother remarked to Mother, "Thank mercy that is over. We won't have another infliction of the old fool for at least 3 months." "Aunt Josephine likes cats in their place," said Lucifer. "I know the breed." And then Gwendolen Vincent Leslie came. Marigold got up early the day she was expected in order to have everything in perfect readiness for the task of entertaining a thorough lady. She was going to be as proper and angelic and spiritual as Gwendolen if it killed her. It was hard to have Mother say pleadingly, "Now, please see if you can behave nicely when Gwenny is here," as if she never behaved nicely when Gwenny wasn't there. For a moment, Marigold felt an unholy desire that the very first thing she might do would be to scoop up a handful of mud and throw it at the visitor. But that passed. No, she was going to be good. Not commonly good, not ordinarily good, but fearfully, extraordinarily, angelically good. They met. Gwendolen stiffly put out a slender, immaculate hand. Marigold glanced apprehensively at her own nails. Thank goodness they were clean, even if they had no half-moons. And oh, Gwendolen was just as beautiful, and just as ladylike, and just as faultless as Aunt Josephine had painted her. Not one comforting, consoling defect anywhere. There were the famous nut-brown curls falling around her delicate, spiritual face. There were the large, mild, dewy blue eyes and the exquisitely arched brows. There were the pearly teeth and the straight Grecian nose, the rosebud mouth, the shell-pink ears that lay back so nicely against her head, the cherubic expression, the sweet voice, very sweet. Marigold wondered if it was jealousy that made her think it was a little too sweet. Marigold could have forgiven Gwendolen her beauty, but she couldn't forgive her hopeless perfection of conduct and manners. They had a ghastly week of it. They didn't, as Uncle Clon would have expressed it, click worth a cent, in spite of the determined spirituality of both, and oh, how good they both were. Grandmother began to think that there might be something in a good example after all. And they bored each other nearly to death. Marigold felt forlornly that they might have had such a good time if Gwendolen wasn't so horribly proper, and if she hadn't to live up to her. Swinging in the apple barn, housekeeping among the currant bushes, rollicking in the old gray hay barn full of cats, prowling around the spruce wood, wading in the brook, gathering mussels down by the shore, making nonsense rhymes, talking sleepy little secrets after they went to bed. But there were no secrets to talk over. Nice girls didn't have secrets. And of course Gwendolen was occupied, presumably, repeating hymns. Once there was a terrible thunderstorm. Marigold was determined she would not show how frightened she was. Gwendolen remarked calmly that the lightning kept her from going to sleep, and covered her head with the bedclothes. Marigold wouldn't do that. Gwendolen might think she was doing it because she was terrified. Mother came to the door and said, "Darling, are you frightened?" "No, not a bit," answered Marigold gallantly, hoping that the bedclothes would keep Gwendolen from noticing how her voice was shaking. "Aren't thunderstorms jolly?" asked Gwendolen in the morning. "Aren't they?" answered Marigold most enthusiastically. It was Gwendolen's beautiful table manners that were hardest to emulate. This had always been one of Marigold's weak points. She was always in such a hurry to get through and be at something, but now she liked to linger at the table as long as possible. There would be all the less time to spend in Gwendolen's dull company, cudgeling her brains for some amusement that would be proper and spiritual. Gwendolen ate slowly, used her knife and fork with the strictest propriety, apparently enjoyed crusts, and said, "Excuse me," whenever indicated, and asked, "May I have the butter, if you please, Aunt Lorraine?" where Marigold would have polished it off in 2 words. "Butter, mums?" And oh, but she would have loved Gwendolen if the latter had ever spilled 1 drop of gravy on the tablecloth. One night they went to church with Grandmother to hear a missionary speak. Marigold hadn't wanted to go especially, but Gwendolen was so eager for it that Grandmother took them along, though she did not approve of small girls going out to night meetings. Marigold enjoyed the walk to church, enjoyed it so much that she had an uneasy feeling that it wasn't spiritual to enjoy things to such an extent. But the white young clouds sailing over the moonlit sky were so dear, the shadows of the spruces on the road so fascinating, the sheep so pearly white in the silver fields, the whole dear fragrant summer night so friendly and lovesome. But when she said timidly to Gwendolen, "Isn't the world lovely after dark?" Gwendolen only said starchily, "I don't worry so much about the heathen in summer when it's warm. But oh, what do they do in cold weather?" Marigold had never worried about the heathen at all, though she faithfully put 1/10 of her little allowance every month in a mite box for them. Again, she felt bitterly her inferiority to Gwendolen Vincent, and loved her none the better for it. But it was that night she prayed, "Please make me pretty good, but not quite as good as Gwen, because she never seems to have any fun." "Those 2 children get on beautifully," said Grandmother. "They've never had the slightest quarrel. I never really expected that the visit would go off half so well." Mother agreed. It was better to agree with Grandmother, but she had a queer conviction that the children weren't getting on at all, though she couldn't have given the slightest reason for it. Came a morning when Grandmother and Mother had to go into Harmony Village. Grandmother was getting a new black satin made, and Mother had a date with the dentist. They would be away most of the forenoon, and Salome had been summoned away by the illness of a relative, but Gwendolen was so good, and Marigold so much improved, that they did not feel any special anxiety over leaving them alone. But just before they drove away, Grandmother said to them, "Now mind you, don't either of you stick your head between the bars of the gate." Nobody to this day knows why Grandmother said that. Marigold believes it was simply predestination. Nobody ever had stuck their head between the bars of the gate, and had been there for 10 years. A substantial gate of slender crisscross iron bars, no flimsy wire gates for Cloud of Spruce. It had never occurred to Marigold to stick her head between the bars of the gate, nor did it occur to her now. But as soon as Grandmother and Mother had disappeared from sight down the road, Gwendolen, the model, who had been strangely silent all the morning, said deliberately, I am going to stick my head through the bars of the gate." Marigold couldn't believe her ears. After what grandmother had said? The good, so obedient Gwendolen. "I'm not going to be bossed by an old woman any longer." She marched down the steps and down the walk, followed by the suddenly alarmed Marigold. "Oh, don't, please, Gwenny," she begged. "I'm sure it isn't safe. The squares are so small. What if you couldn't get it out again?" For answer, Gwendolen stuck her head through one of the oblong spaces between the bars. Pushed her head through, to be exact. And it was a tight squeeze. "There!" she said triumphantly, her mop of curls falling forward over her face and confirming a wild suspicion Marigold had felt at the breakfast table, that Gwendolen had not washed behind her ears that morning. "Oh, take it out, please, Gwenny," begged Marigold. "I'll take it out when I please, Miss Prunes and Prisms. I'm so sick of being good that I'm just going to be as bad as I want to be after this. I don't care how shocked you will be. You just watch the next thing I do." Marigold's world seemed to spin around her. Before it grew steady again, she heard Gwendolen give a frantic little yowl. "Oh, I can't get my head out," she cried. "I can't get my head out." Nor could she. The thick mop of curls falling forward made just the difference of getting in and getting out. Pull, writhe, twist, squirm as she might, she could not free herself. Marigold, in a panic, climbed over the gate and tried to push the head back, with no results save yelps of anguish from Gwendolen, who, if she were hurt as badly as she sounded, was very badly hurt indeed. Gwendolen was certainly very uncomfortable. The unnatural position made her back and legs ache frightfully. She declared that the blood was running into her head and she would die. Marigold, shaking in the grip of this new terror, murmured faintly, "Will it do any good to pray?" "Pray, if you went for the blacksmith it would do more good than all the prayers in the world, you sickening pious little cat," said the spiritual Gwendolen. "The blacksmith! Fidame Gautier." Marigold went cold all over. She was in mortal dread of Fidame, who was a dead shot with tobacco juice and not the least particular about his targets. She had never really believed the legend about the baby, but the impression of it was still in possession of her feelings. Fidame was very gruff and quick-tempered and never stood for any kids hanging round his shop. Marigold felt that she could never have the courage to go to Fidame. "Oh, don't you think if I took you round the waist and pulled hard I could pull you out?" she gasped. "Yes, and pull my head clean off," snapped Gwendolen. She gave another agonized squirm, but to no effect, except that she nearly scraped one of her ears off. Suddenly she began shrieking like a maniac. "I can't stand this another minute. I can't," she gasped between shrieks. "Oh, I'm dying! I'm dying!" Marigold dared hesitate no longer. She tore off down the road like a mad thing. And she went. As she went, the wild howls of Gwendolen Vincent could be heard faintly and more faintly. Was Gwenny dead? Or just yelled out? "Hey, left a pie in the oven?" shouted Uncle Jed Clark as she spun by him. Marigold answered not. To reach the blacksmith shop, to gasp out her tale, took all the breath she had. "For de love of all de saints," said Fidame. He killed a nail on the floor with a squirt of tobacco juice and hunted out a file very deliberately. Fidame had never seen any reason why he should hurry, and Gwenny might be dead. Eventually the file was found, and he started up the road like a grim black ogre of fairy tales. Gwendolen was not dead. She was still shrieking. Here now, stop that yelling, said Fidame unsympathetically. It took some time to file the bar, and Fidame was not overly gentle, but at last it was done, and Gwendolen Vincent was free, considerably rumpled and disheveled, with a head that felt as if it were 3 sizes larger than ordinarily. Don't you go for do dat fool ting any more again, said Fidame warningly. Gwendolen looked up at him and said spitefully, Old devil-face! Marigold nearly dropped in her tracks. Ladylike? Spiritual? Not to speak of commonly ungrateful? You keep that sassy tongue of yours in your head, said Fidame blackly as he turned away. Gwendolen stuck her tongue out at him. Marigold was feeling a bit shrewish after her terror. She looked at Gwendolen and uttered the 4 most unpopular words in the world. I told you so, said Marigold. Oh, shut your head! This was indecent. Shut your mouth was an old friend. Marigold had often heard the boys at school using it, but shut your head was an interloper. I don't care if you are shocked, Miss Prim, said Gwendolen. I'm through with trying to be as good as you. Nobody could be. I don't care what Aunt Josephine says. Aunt Josephine? Yes, Aunt Josephine. She does nothing all the time. She's at Rush Hill. But sing your praises. Mine? Gasped Marigold. Yes, she just held you up as a perfect model, always telling me how good you were. I knew I'd hate you, and I didn't want to come here for a visit. I like to go somewhere where something's happening all the time, but Father made me. And I made up my mind I'd be just as ladylike as you. Such a week. Aunt Josephine told me you were a model, a perfect lady. I've been trying to be as good as you, gasped Marigold. They looked at each other for a moment and understood. Gwendolen began to laugh. I just couldn't stand it a day longer. That's why I stuck my head in the gate. Aunt Josephine told me you said hymns before you went to sleep and took an angel for your model, and I was just stuffing Aunt Josephine. My, but it was easy to pull her leg. Which was wicked, of course, but in proportion to the wickedness did Marigold's sudden and newborn affection for Gwendolen Vincent increase. She made me so mad praising you. I wanted to show her you weren't the only saint in the world. Did you really want to hear that missionary? Asked Marigold. I sure did. Wanted to hear if he'd tell any cannibal yarns, so's we could make a game of them when I went back to Rush Hill, said Gwenny promptly, which was wickeder still. But oh, how Marigold loved Gwenny. We've wasted a week, she said mournfully. Never mind. We'll make up for it this week, said Gwendolen Vincent ominously. Grandmother can't understand it to this day. She never forgot that second week. One of your deep ones, that, Salome always said afterwards whenever anyone mentioned the name of Gwendolen Vincent. You can't always tell a saint by the cut of his jib, remarked Lucifer, who had never felt that his tail was safe, in spite of Gwendolen's saintliness.